I made a more personal video going over, that was about an individual. Now let's make a video that is a little bit more intellectual in nature. We need to balance this out because, intellectual concepts are good for your brain and things such as this nature. Now, with that being said, I hear about this idea of a dimension. This idea of a dimension that would possibly give our reality a greater resolution. Now, what I am, of course, referring to is the existence of a fourth spatial dimension. In other words, we have width, length, depth, and a fourth space of some kind. I can't really point to it. But if you can imagine that as I bend my finger, it's pointing somewhere that's not inward, that's basically the best way to describe it. Now, this could, in theory, exist, but at the same time, there is a possible argument that can refute it. That is to say that you have to be able to isolate a dimension in order to say how many dimensions something actually has. Let me give an example. A piece of paper like this. Okay? Now, something that is a line is considered to be a single dimension because that thing only has one direction. It has to exist in a direction. Okay. Now, two dimensions is considered to be like a piece of paper. It has up, down, side to side, but no depth. The only thing is about this theory that kind of doesn't hold up is that this paper actually does have depth. You just normally don't ever see it, but you're beginning to see a little bit of the depth as I bring this piece of paper up closer. Basically, what I'm saying is that in order for this analogy to work, you would have to be able to isolate dimensions. You would have to give an example of an object that has no dimensions, which is a point. This could be done theoretically by imagining an infinitely small thing. But an infinitely small measurement is still a measurement, and it could be said that it still has width, length, and depth. When we take two dots and connect them that already have a certain amount of depth, there has to be some substance to it to be able to make out an object to begin with. But since a line has no width or depth, it just has length, you can't really do that. There's no substance. Literally, if you think about it, there's two different ways of looking at dimensions. One way is linear. Linear means that you can have a zeroth dimension, you can have a first dimension, and you can have a second dimension and a third dimension. Now, if this is true, then it makes sense to make a further assumption that a fourth dimension could exist. And this is a good mathematical concept regardless, and it's very good for your brain to try to imagine the possible mathematics that would go into the logic of a fourth dimension, because a dimension is a bit of an abstract concept to begin with. But there's another way of looking at dimensions, and that is that each dimension has to exist simultaneously for each other's existence to exist anyway, because all things in the universe have to have substance. If we argue that a two-dimensional being in a two-dimensional space sees a line, which is considered to be one-dimensional, outside the idea of it being an illusion of two dimensions and actually being three dimensions just so small that we can't see it, this is theoretically, at least in our three-dimensional perspective, impossible. Because there's always going to be depth. And in order for that two-dimensional creature to see a slither of something, they're seeing the depth of the object. You see what I'm saying? So, largely the idea of linear dimensions is based on the idea that dimensions can be isolated like numbers, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. But what we see in our natural world, unless there's some type of mathematical possibility to make something that is infinitely flat, which in theory would have absolutely no substance, then you can't it doesn't necessarily make sense that you would argue for a fourth dimension unless our third dimensional space is also an illusion of three-dimensional space. And there could be a fourth dimension that the universe is existing in, or a fifth dimension, or a sixth dimension, etc. That's basically my argument for why the fourth dimensional space is kind of faulty. It's kind of based off of a linear assumption that you can have dimensions that are separated from each other. Because this piece of paper here, if it was infinitely flat, then it would have infinitely no substance. It would be non-existent, in other words. There'd be nothing to it. It would have no substance. So in order for this paper to be a flat square, it has to have some substance. Now there are people that would say that that's just our 3D logic, which, I mean, I'm not necessarily saying that it isn't, but something infinitely flat seems like it should also be infinitely, well, non-existent. And if something could be infinitely flat, and an infinitesimal was a legitimate measurement, it would still be a measurement. An infinitely small density is still a density, after all. So, is two dimensions possible? Well, mathematically, yes. But I think it's probably more likely that the universe exists in more than one frequency of matter. There could be multiple frequencies of matter that we have absolutely no idea whatsoever exist. And this would explain a lot of seemingly, previously misunderstood spiritual phenomenon where people will see things glitch in and out of existence. Now, this could be due to a fourth spatial dimension, but like I said before, this all comes down to the likelihood of being able to represent dimensions linearly. In other words, you would have to demonstrate a first dimension, a zeroth dimension, and a second dimension alongside a third dimension to make the final assumption of a fourth spatial dimension in the traditional sense.